Hi, this is Michael Altos. We're continuing our discussion of renal physiology, and this is recording part 2. Now, the osmolarity of the urine can range over a very wide spectrum, from as dilute as 50 milliosm per liter all the way up to 1400. It really depends on how much free water the body needs to get rid of. And this lets us maintain our plasma volume without changing solute concentration. And this process is controlled by a hormone called ADH, anti-diuretic hormone. It's also called vasopressin. Now, we know that vasopressin is secreted from the pituitary gland, specifically the posterior pituitary, and it's secreted in response to increased serum osmolarity. So if we have too much solute concentration in the plasma, ADH is going to be secreted. ADH works, it acts on the distal tubule and the collecting duct, and it makes the tubule reabsorb more free water. Now, the urine output can't go to zero. There's always a minimum volume of urine that has to be excreted, even if there's no free water being taken in. This lets us get rid of metabolic waste products and ions that we don't need. So if we say that your normal daily solute excretion has to be about 600 milliosms, and the maximum urine concentration is, before I said 1400, for now let's just say 1200 milliosms, just for even numbers. So then your obligatory urine volume is going to be half a liter per day. The body has to excrete that much, or else you're going to be unable to get rid of the solutes you need to get rid of. For example, that's why if a person is stranded at sea, they can't drink seawater to stop dehydration, because even though they're taking in volume, they're also taking in so much solute, so much sodium chloride, that it's just going to require them to have even more urine output, and they'll become dehydrated as a result. Here are some diagrams, which you don't need to memorize, but they illustrate the idea that we're talking about. We see here the ability of the kidneys to make dilute urine. So this is a person who's very well hydrated, and we see that the numbers here are the relative osmolarities in these different compartments. And we see that as the urine starts, it's at an osmolarity of about 300, which is pretty much normal human osmolarity. And then as it goes, it gets more concentrated. But then the body is able to dilute it. As it takes more and more water out of the urine, it becomes very dilute. On the other hand, in a person who is not taking in very much volume, the urine is able to get super concentrated and then maintain a lot of that concentration, taking a lot less water out of the urine and maintaining a concentrated urine. The details of this illustration are a little bit beyond the scope of this course. Certainly you're welcome to read about it and ask me questions if you'd like, but you don't have to memorize any of the osmolarities on this chart or any of the details. Now, the ability to concentrate urine is very important, and when this becomes impaired, we see different clinical conditions that you need to be aware of. The first is called SIADH, the syndrome of inappropriate ADH secretion. These people are secreting too much ADH, and if anti-diuretic hormone makes you not diurese, it makes you not pee, so you're saving a lot of free water. Causes of SIADH are, there are a lot of them. Often we see it in head injuries, people who've had a bleed in their brain or tumors. There are also some cancers like small cell lung cancer, and drugs, especially carbamazepine and some antipsychotic agents. When this happens, the patients retain so much free water that they start to dilute their plasma and they become hyponatremic. And they'll especially have toxicity of the central nervous system at a sodium below 110. Their urine will be very concentrated, and often this is a diagnosis of exclusion. Once you look at other causes of hyponatremia, then you may arrive at the conclusion that the patient actually has SIADH. How do we treat it? Well, fluid restriction is very helpful so that they don't become even more diluted. Sometimes we need to give hypertonic saline in order to maintain normal physiologic sodium concentrations. And diuretics may be helpful to get rid of the excess free water. Remember that when we correct serum sodium, we need to correct it by less than half a milliequivalent per hour, or else we run the risk of developing CPM, central pontine myonolysis, which is damage to the central nervous system. On the other hand, we have diabetes insipidus. This is not related to diabetes mellitus, which is the disease involving blood glucose and insulin. Diabetes means flow, and just like regular diabetics have increased urine flow, patients with diabetes insipidus also have increased urine flow. These patients have no action of ADH, and therefore they don't have anything to prevent diuresis. They make a lot of very dilute urine. Usually when we talk about diabetes insipidus, we're talking about neurogenic or central diabetes insipidus. These patients aren't secreting any ADH from their pituitary. Again, it could be caused by head trauma or tumors or surgery, especially transsphenoidal surgeries near the pituitary adenoma or subarachnoid hemorrhage. The usual time frame, if it occurs, would be 4 to 24 hours after pituitary surgery, and it can occur and then resolve over time. We diagnose diabetes insipidus with symptoms like polydipsia, which means increased thirst, polyuria, very large urine outputs, and hypernatremia, because they're losing a lot of free water, so the sodium in the plasma gets concentrated. These patients can make many hundreds of milliliters of urine every hour, 4, 5, 6, maybe even 1,000 milliliters of urine every hour. You'll see their urine-specific gravity is very low, urine osmolarity is very low, random serum osmolarity tends to be on the high side, and there are tests that can be done to confirm diabetes insipidus. The treatment for DI would be to replace antidiuretic hormone or vasopressin. There's a drug called desmopressin, which is a replacement for vasopressin. Carbamazepine, which we saw causes SIADH, is therefore an appropriate treatment sometimes in patients who have diabetes insipidus. We also need to replace these ongoing free water losses from the urine, usually with something less than saline, something like D5 half normal saline, replace usually about 2/3 of the urine output. There is another kind of DI called nephrogenic diabetes insipidus. These patients do make ADH, but the kidneys are unable to respond to it. And so obviously those patients will need different kinds of treatments, since things like vasopressin or desmopressin will also be ineffective at the kidneys. Now there's a feedback loop involving the osmoreceptors and antidiuretic hormone. So let's take a patient who has a water deficit. They're hypovolemic, and specifically they have a free water deficit. So that means that their extracellular fluid will become more concentrated. The osmolarity will increase. And basically we're talking about increased plasma sodium concentration. That's the main ion in the extracellular fluid. So as this happens, the osmoreceptor cells, which are located in your hypothalamus, begin to shrink, as we know that cells shrink when they are in a hypertonic environment. This sends signals to the pituitary gland to secrete more ADH. That makes you retain more water in the kidneys, and that decreases your urine output. There are other things that trigger secretion of ADH, hypotension, decreased plasma volume, nausea, hypoxia. On the other hand, alcohol decreases ADH secretion, which is one of the reasons why alcohol is a known diuretic. We should just note that substances like angiotensin II and aldosterone, which are involved in controlling sodium and water retention, so there isn't going to be a lot of effect on sodium concentration or plasma osmolarity here. So we just want to highlight that difference, that some substances like angiotensin II and aldosterone make you retain water, but through the mechanism of retaining sodium. So we don't see a lot of changes in osmolarity or sodium concentration. That's different than ADH, which really just makes you retain free water only. And so we see a lot of changes in osmolarity and sodium concentration. All right, so we've talked a lot about sodium. We're going to move on to discussion of other ions now. And the next ion we'll discuss is potassium. Normal potassium concentration in the extracellular fluid is somewhere in the range of 3.5 to 5 milliequivalents per liter. And remember that virtually all of your total body potassium is intracellular. For example, your intracellular fluid might have a K of 3,920 milliequivalents. Your extracellular fluid might have 59 milliequivalents. So you can see a vast majority, 98% of it, is in the cells. Cells are very sensitive to changes in your extracellular potassium levels. Usually your daily potassium intake is somewhere around 100 milliequivalents, and most of it is renally excreted, and most of the rest of it is excreted in your feces. So when someone has a dietary intake of potassium, if your extracellular fluid potassium goes up, it quickly gets redistributed into the cells, because we know that the heart and other parts of the body are very sensitive to hyperkalemia. How does potassium move from the extracellular fluid into the intracellular fluid? Well, substances that promote that movement are insulin, aldosterone, beta stimulation, and alkalosis. On the other hand, release of potassium from the cells back into the extracellular fluid would be the opposite. So when patients have a deficiency of insulin or aldosterone, if they have beta blockade, acidosis, and of course if any cells are damaged through cell lysis or strenuous exercise, those would lead to hyperkalemia in the extracellular fluid. Now let's take a look at what's going on in the kidneys. In this diagram, we see on the right side the renal tubular lumen. This is where the urine is being formed. These are the cells that line the renal tubule. And on the left side, we see the renal interstitium. The cells in the distal tubule can regulate how much potassium is lost into the renal tubule or reabsorbed, depending on the needs of the body. So for example, aldosterone stimulates sodium reabsorption. As we learned, it makes you save sodium and p-potassium through this sodium-potassium ATPase pump. And then the potassium is secreted into the renal tubule and excreted. Other things that will lead to excretion of potassium include increased renal tubular blood flow. For example, in someone who's making a lot of urine or whose volume expanded or has a high sodium intake, or even some diuretics cause that. Patients who become acutely acidotic will see decreased activity of this sodium-potassium ATPase pump. And so therefore they will have less potassium secretion. But chronic acidosis actually leads to loss of potassium. And that's because it starts to inhibit sodium reabsorption. And that increases renal tubular blood flow and increases potassium secretion. What are the main things you need to know here? You need to know, of course, that aldosterone makes us save sodium and p-potassium. We need to know that acute acidosis can make you lose potassium, but chronic acidosis could could decrease your potassium losses, but chronic acidosis will increase your potassium losses. Now let's talk about some disorders of potassium. First, hyperkalemia, which starts at a serum level of about 5.5 milliequivalents per liter. And up to about 6, we would call it mild, and the 6 to 7 range is moderate, and above 7 is severe. Hyperkalemia can be fatal, especially above levels of about 8.5 milliequivalents per liter. Hyperkalemia can be caused by increased potassium intake or decreased excretion, or shifting of potassium from that large repository in the intracellular fluid out to the extracellular fluid. So patients who have renal failure can't get rid of their potassium. Patients who take medications like potassium-sparing medications or diuretics. Any condition that leads to a decrease in aldosterone. And once again, the acidosis, which we discussed a moment ago. Acidosis, basically, the way I like to think of it, is that it makes hydrogen ion move into the cells in order to attenuate some of that acidosis. When hydrogen ion moves in, potassium moves out. And so that's why acidosis creates hyperkalemia. Also, as we said before, cellular destruction leads to shifts of potassium from the ICF to the ECF. Patients with hyperkalemia may have very nonspecific signs or symptoms, including palpitations or muscle weakness. But on the ECG, we typically see peaked T waves, that is not necessarily tall T waves, but T waves with a sharp point on them. As the hyperkalemia worsens, we see widening of the QRS complex, progressing to a sine wave pattern, and eventually ventricular fibrillation and asystole. The treatment of hyperkalemia depends a lot on what the actual value of the potassium is, as well as how fast the hyperkalemia developed, and if there's any evidence of toxicity. Some people use the mnemonic C big K drop to remember all the treatments for hyperkalemia. The C stands for calcium, which helps prevent cardiac toxicity. Typically, we use 10 mils of 10% calcium gluconate given over 10 minutes. The B is for beta agonists like albuterol, which will shift potassium into the cells. And B also stands for bicarbonate, that is sodium bicarbonate, 1 amp given over 5 minutes in order to help exchange hydrogen ion for potassium ion. The I is for insulin, 10 units given IV push in order to enhance potassium uptake into cells. Together with that is the G for glucose. That would be 1 amp of D50 given along with the insulin to prevent hypoglycemia. K is for Kayexalate, which is an oral polystyrene resin dissolved in sorbitol. Obviously, this needs to be given orally, either swallowed or else through an oral or nasogastric tube. And finally, D stands for diuretics or dialysis, one other mechanism of excreting potassium from the system. That's the end of this recording. Please do let me know if you have questions about any of the material, and we will see you in class.